I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 21 of the House of Commons Standing Transport, Infrastructure and Communities. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 3rd, 2022, the committee is meeting to study reducing red tape and costs on rural and urban Canadian airports. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. As per the directive of the Board of Internal Economy on March 10, 2022, all those attending the meeting in person must wear a mask, except for members who are at their place during proceedings.
The benefits of which please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your microphone, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those joining on Zoom, you have the choice. At the bottom of your screen, choose either Floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your patience and understanding in this regard. Appearing before the committee for the first half of today's meeting are Monsieur David Rowe, Vice President, Government and Community Relations for Air Canada, Mr. Howard Liebman, Senior Director, Government and Community Affairs for Air Transat, Madame Suzanne Acton-Gervin, Interim President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Airlines Council of Canada, and Andy Gibbons, Director, Government Relations and Regulatory Affairs for WestJet Airlines Limited. Witnesses, on behalf of the committee, I'd like to welcome you to our committee today and thank you in advance for your testimony. We will now begin the opening remarks with the National Airlines Council of Canada. You have 5 minutes and the floor is yours.
Bonjour et merci, Madame.
Good afternoon and thank you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee. My name is Suzanne Acton-Gervais and I'm accompanied by some members of the National Airlines Council of Canada Executive Committee and its Board of Directors. David Rowe, Vice President, Government and Communities Relations, Air Canada. Howard Liebman, Senior Director, Government and Community Affairs for Air Transit. And Andrew Gibbons, Government and Regulatory Affairs, WestJet. The National Airlines Council of Canada is an association bringing together Canada's largest passenger airlines in Canada: Air Canada, WestJet, Air Transit, and Jazz Aviation. As airline companies, we make operational and implement the policies on behalf of the federal government. Prior to the pandemic, the members of the National Airlines Council of Canada transported collectively over 8 million passengers per year. Before the pandemic, the airports had experienced unprecedented growth and volumes. Canadians have never been so well connected with each other and with the entire world.
As Canada's airlines and their workers, we were the first hit, the hardest hit, and the last to recover. In order to recover, airlines must be competitive in a global context. Our members serve over 302 destinations across the world. But Canada's legacy public health restrictions, many of which remain in place exclusively for travel, set us apart from a growing list of over 50 countries that have removed barriers to travel altogether. Since the outset of the pandemic, airlines have worked to protect employee and passenger health. Our most valuable asset will always be our people. And the airline sector needs more workers to support the return to travel. But we rely on the Government of Canada to process credentials for airline workers and travelers at a speed that keeps pace with Canadian travelers' needs and our member airlines' operations. Transport Canada, Canada Border Services Agency, the Canadian Air Transport Security Authority, Service Canada, airports, NAV Canada, all need to be properly resourced to ensure that travel and tourism can resume to pre-pandemic levels. Travelers need confidence that their journey can be predictable, timely, and enjoyable with clear service standards. Recent reports of backlogs at airports and excessive wait times are concerning and must be immediately addressed and rectified by the federal government. We are meeting here today during Tourism Week in Canada. We welcome the supportive statements made by the Prime Minister, the Minister of Tourism, and others. But I would say to them that one of the most important actions they can take right now to support Canadian tourism is to address the untenable situation at our airports. Before I conclude, I would note that Canada's airlines are customers of Canadian airports and of NAV Canada. In Canada, it is well documented that high taxes and fees imposed on Canadian airlines and travelers create a competitive disadvantage for Canadians' aviation industry versus other jurisdictions. These include airport rents, air traveler security charges, airport improvement fees, NAV Canada's navigation fees, and city taxes, among others. The pandemic highlighted flaws in Canada's user pay model and exacerbated this competitive disadvantage. Facing fewer travelers during the pandemic, a number of institutions have increased their fees to compensate. When combined, these fees hamstring the aviation sector and associated local economic benefits. The federal government could take the immediate step of reviewing all third-party fees and charges and consider reinvesting these amounts back into the airports. Grâce à la collaboration continue du gouvernement.
Thanks to the ongoing cooperation of the Government of Canada, airline companies in Canada will contribute to a return to a connected lifestyle, one which is so important to all of us in order to connect people and maintain our economy. We will be happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much, Acton Gervais. We'll begin with Mr. Dowdle. Mr. Dowdle, you have 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, and I certainly want to take this opportunity to thank all our witnesses here for their testimony. I think it's pretty important study that we're doing is reducing red tape. I guess my first questions are going to be to you, Mr. Gibbons. On February 15th, WestJet released a statement saying that the WestJet Group will continue to advocate, based on science and data, for the removal of all measures impacting fully vaccinated air travelers. Can you tell me if WestJet presently believe that the government is following science and data in its continued enforcement of measures aimed at unvaccinated as well as the vaccinated Canadians?
Thank you very much for the question. Good afternoon. And by the way, thank you very much for having me today. It's great to have these discussions. Your question was, does our company believe the government is following science?
That's correct. On February 15th, that was stated.
Well, I think there's been a big debate about this, and I think that's why for many, many months we've said and encouraged the government to table the public health advice that they receive from Dr. Tam and others, so that, because our greatest lament that we've had during COVID is the unfortunate politicization of travel. And we don't really blame anyone for this, but I think everyone in this room knows that travel has been a highly charged issue, and that has been very unfortunate. So we need to depoliticize it. We need to deconstruct it a bit and actually just make sure that every Canadian, every parliamentarian, every stakeholder, every employer has that information, so it can be crystal clear what is a public health advice and directive and what is not. And that's been a request from day one.
And, on May 31st, the WestJet CEO Alexis von Hansbroek tweeted, and I quote, "Vaccine mandate for air travelers and employees needs to be dropped. As vaccines are not preventing the spreading of the virus since Omicron, there is no more logic to maintain it. This will also relax some of the operational challenges at the airport." End of quote. Is this now the official position of WestJet?
It is the position of WestJet. I can confirm that. And as it relates to operational matters, which is what we're talking about today, which is red tape and backlogs and what's happening at our airports across the country. The CBSA and CATSA have all said, and the minister has said, that labor shortages are one of the major issues for the backlogs. And we've observed that we don't have a number, but there are potentially hundreds and hundreds of CATSA screeners who are unemployed as a result of the vaccine mandate. And the question we have rightfully and legitimately to the government is, can those individuals come back to work and help with this situation? We think the answer should be yes.
Okay, so I guess a follow-up to that, it almost seems like it's not the science, but political science, I guess, is what you're saying. So can you approximately, how many employees have lost their jobs at WestJet during the pandemic?
We've been public about this. It's been over 300 employees lost their jobs because of the mandate.
And those ones are directly linked to the mandate, 300 directly linked? Okay.
Yeah.
And how many cases of any of the variants of COVID-19 have been traced to a trip on one of your aircrafts?
None that we are aware of, and I believe Dr. Tam has been very public about transmissibility rates on the aircraft, and that's one of the major issues we have. Mr. Dowdall and Suzanne mentioned this in her opening remarks is the discrepancy between how an air traveler is treated and how every other consumer activity in Canada is treated. There is no random testing at Rogers Centre. There's no random testing at the grocery store. There's no random testing anywhere in Canadian society except in aviation, and our safety record is exemplary. So we're just asking legitimate questions, and at the same time, I always have to say we are an exceptional partner to the government. We implement their programs. We work with their public health agency. We work with Transport Canada. So this is not a fractious relationship. It's one of a very strong partnership, but there are irritants very clearly.
So, and I guess just one more question is, do you think the ongoing pandemic regulations in Canada are putting WestJet at a disadvantage versus other carriers outside of Canada?
I think we can have lots of conversations about competitiveness. I think the challenge before us, and everyone agrees, from the minister to every parliamentarian from every party, is that we need to have a more seamless recovery. Right? People will be discouraged from booking if they think their family and their children have to wait on the tarmac for 2 hours just to get into a customs hall. Business travelers will maybe not go to that conference in Toronto or Vancouver or Regina because they're concerned about a wait. So we really need to address those. And I think everyone wants the same thing, and everyone has to, pitch in here and really address these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Riold, I have a question for you as well. When you testified at this committee on February 4th, 2021, you said, quote, Air Canada is a strong proponent of a science-based, data-driven reopening of our borders. It can be done safely. Do you believe that the continued government-imposed airport testing and mandates are science-based and data-driven at this time?
Écoutez, thanks for your question. Just allow me, I will answer in French. Écoutez,
Listen, we have always been in favor of the implementation of health measures based on science to enable to a good return. But one important issue is, as my colleague said, you have to be coherent, and you have to make sure that the same measures are applied to all industries. And today, we can see that the vast majority of provinces have taken measures, and most economic sectors are not subject to these mandates. So, yes, I think we should review the current policy and the measures in place for airlines, and we have to be coherent with what is happening elsewhere in the community and also what's happening in other countries in the world. Thank you, Mr. Rowe.
We have Mr. Badaway. Mr. Badaway, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to thank the witnesses for being here today. And I'll preface my questions by saying that, I think for the most part, we're embarking on a study like this, not to be political and taking some of the comments that have already been made and positions that have already been made. I want to concentrate on the irritants, and of course, with that said, also concentrate on the challenges with respect to delays, some of the barriers that were already mentioned, the implications or why those barriers are in place. For example, we've heard in the past that the spread of COVID amongst passengers, amongst employees, amongst the supply chains have resulted in some cancellations and delays in the airline industry. So how do we deal with that? How do we ensure that the airlines can participate within our travel economy in a seamless manner? And how do we get people to move around comfortably? So a couple questions, and I think I'll concentrate these questions on Ms. Acton-Gervais and on her responsibility on behalf of many of the airlines. First off, and understanding that parts of the problem is in relation to traveler behavior, and specifically that people used to plan their travel months ahead of time, but now wait much later to reserve their tickets. So, Ms. Acton-Gervais, have you observed this in particular? First question. And second question, do you have any data you can share with the committee about this particular issue?
Thank you for the question. Canadians are eager to travel, and the world is eager to come to Canada, and this is good news. The announcement made by the Canadian government on April 1st, dropping the requirement for pre-departure testing to enter Canada, there was definitely a direct link between this alleviation and the increase in bookings. And nevertheless, in our view, as said, more needs to be done. The phenomenon of people waiting for last minute to book travel is based on the lack of predictability and consistency. And so if we were able to address some of this, it would help instill further confidence for the travelers. When it comes to data, I would be happy to take your question under consideration and to follow up with you following the committee.
And I appreciate you taking that under consideration, and I would actually expect it to be followed up so that way we can act on it with the recommendations that we're going to present to the minister, and then therefore the decisions that the minister will in fact make to some extent on your behalf. My next question with respect to tracking. Now, there's been comments made about science, and of course we would expect the health department as well as Ms. Tam to make her thoughts known as well as recommendations based on science. That's their job. And comments that are made by people, politicians, industry leaders. I guess to some extent, I would be very curious in what science they're actually bringing forward to make those comments. So I guess my next question is to that: how does the industry track the issue internationally? Is there one organization that compiles information about airport delays? Are there consistent metrics used to measure performance, etc.? Can you touch on that?
What I can say is the International Air Transport Association, the airline trade association that represents the world's airlines, over 290 airlines globally, does track this information. From the perspective of tracking, from the public health perspective, we are not public health experts. Of course, we are aviation experts. However, having said that, what we can say is approximately 1% of COVID importation at the air border has been attributed to air travel. So this is what was the catalyst to some of the decision making on April 1st to remove the pre-departure testing.
And thank you for that, which to some extent proves that it's been working with respect to what's been put in place. I guess my last question, Ms. Acton-Gervais, is with respect to I guess in a more broader sense, how did the airlines in fact survive the pandemic? I know it's been a challenging time, there's no question, but you're here and they're here. So, can you give me some comments? And I'm asking this question not just for the obvious in terms of what's happening today, but what may happen in the future. And of course, the way we would react better in the future. So how did the airlines get past the pandemic, and how do you look at yourselves as moving forward, and what more can we do to help you move forward?
Thank you for the question. The pandemic has been hard on everybody, no exceptions, and it has been particularly hard on Canada's airlines and its workers. The pandemic has exposed vulnerabilities and shortcomings in how the industry is funded, and we have a unique opportunity coming out of the pandemic to address these issues and improve the viability of the industry as a whole. The federal government could take immediate steps of reviewing all third-party fees and charges and consider reinvesting these back into the airports. And further to that, what I could add as well is that we need a path and a plan as we go through the ebbs and flows of the pandemic and the possible new variants. We are eager to continue to work with the Government of Canada in order to ensure the ongoing operations of our airlines and, of course, the larger travel and tourism industry as a whole.
Wonderful. Thank you,
Thank you very much, Mr. Badaway. Next, prochainement, nous avons Mr. Barcelot-Duval. Mr. Barcelot-Duval, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Barcelot-Duval, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the witnesses for coming here today. It's very much appreciated. I'd like to begin with a question for Mr. Lieben from Air Transat. We found out that Air Transat was trying to establish connections internationally from regional airports. Some people could say that this was one airline benefits from the services provided from another airline. And that's very interesting when you talk about a regional airline transportation. Mr. Liebman, do you see more associations like this occurring in the future? Do you think that this type of agreement in Quebec or in the rest of Canada would allow better cohabitation of these airlines? Thank you very much for your question. And thank you for this invitation to testify today. The answer is yes. We're very proud of this agreement, and we foresee other benefits. It encourages travelers, and it makes it much easier for the client experience. We did this with PASCAN, and it's an advantage for international travel as well, bringing international clients to the region, and people in our regions have easier access and more affordable access to our international network. Obviously, Air Transat doesn't have regional airlines, but you could benefit from this. Are there any ways that the government could facilitate the implementation of similar agreements? Are there other steps that the government could take to help you? I'm going to open up the question to my colleagues who are involved in the regional transportation sector, but we would support any initiative designed to encourage regional transportation. I think our country has a lot to offer to tourists, and so this is something that would be most welcome. So something that we could add? Do you have anything we wish to add? If I may, I think that when it comes to regional transportation, we have to bear in mind competitiveness and fees that are levied on them. So they have reduced volumes and they have high fees that they have to pay. That has an impact. So if we look at the committee study, you can see what types of costs are applied to the entire industry. And whether we're talking about federal airports or others, when you look at the amount of taxes that that airports have to pay to municipalities and so on and so forth, and the impact of the pandemic on navigation, all these costs are being reflected in the cost of transportation, and in the small regional airports that has an even greater impact because, of course, there are fewer clients there. Thank you. Mr. Gibbons, do you wish to add to the conversation? We're talking about inter-airline agreements, but do you have anything to add to that?
A few comments. Permettez-moi de parler en.
If I may, I would prefer to speak in English.
On regional travel, we've signed many interline agreements and code share agreements and been innovative, and we didn't need the government to encourage us in this direction. There was a market that we wanted to serve. A great example of that is in Western Canada, where we partnered with Pacific Coastal, a smaller British Columbia-based airline, and we jointly shared the operations of 32-seat aircraft, so we could bring service to places like Medicine Hat, Lethbridge, Lloydminster, et cetera, where many communities that had never had any competition. And then out east, we do have a full interline agreement with PAL. So, I think coming out of the pandemic, and Monsieur Rowe touched on this, coming out of the pandemic, it's become increasingly clear that regional travel is the essential, is how these communities across Canada stay connected to each other in the world. Yet the way the government treats air travel under the user pay model is very different than other modes of transportation. So, if you look at a province like Newfoundland and Labrador, the federal government currently subsidizes a rail passenger. I have nothing against rail. It currently subsidizes rail passengers from Montreal to Moncton to the tune of hundreds of dollars each one. Yet, Mr. Rogers said it, he does not have railways. So I think we need to look at intermodal equity, and I think if you're looking at recommendations about how regional travel and transportation can come to life and can be more cost competitive, I would say we'd take a very close look at how the federal government treats different modes of transport in terms of taxation and how it treats the air traveler, not airlines, the air traveler. And I think there might be some policy answers there.
Monsieur Liebman.
Thank you. Mr. Liebman, if I could go back to you. We know that your company, and well as others, have been hit by the pandemic, but we've talked about air transit a lot in the past few years, and we see that the travel industry, despite everything, is doing better. Is there anything that the government could do to allow your company in particular? Thank you for your question. Yes, indeed. I would underscore for everyone's benefit that air transit was shut down for a total of 10 months during the pandemic. And it was very much affected by Omicron this winter. Our industry was amongst the first to have been hit by the pandemic, and I think we're about the last to get out of this crisis. There are some opportunities. If we look at the study that is now before your committee, this is an opportunity perhaps to review everything that deals with charges and taxes in the system, keeping an eye on the contribution that our sector can make to the Canadian economy, and to bearing in mind international competition and looking at the experience of other jurisdictions. Thank you very much, Mr. Lieben. Thank you, Mr. Barcelo-Duval.
Mr. Bachrach, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'll ask for my colleagues' forbearance while I ask some questions very specific to Northwest BC, but I imagine they would also apply in other areas of Canada. In the region I represent, there's a vast discrepancy in the price that air passengers pay for flights to the same hub airport. So, for instance, I had my staff look at the cost of flying in the first week of July from Terrace to Vancouver, from Smithers to Vancouver, and from Prince Rupert to Vancouver. So the lowest fare each day to fly from Terrace to Vancouver averaged $198. From Smithers to Vancouver, it was $302. And from Prince Rupert, it was $443. Same airplanes, approximately the same distance, and yet a dramatically different cost. And this is something that has a profound impact on the communities that are facing unaffordable airfares. So perhaps to Ms. Acton-Gervais or to Mr. Rayot, I'm curious if you could explain why it costs over double to fly out of Prince Rupert and half again as much to fly out of Smithers.
Thank you for the question. High taxes and fees imposed on airlines and travelers create a competitive disadvantage of our aviation industry. Facing fewer travelers during the pandemic, a number of institutions have increased their fees to compensate. The federal costs that airlines absorb, such as airport rents, air traveler security charges, airport improvement fees, NAV Canada fees, city taxes, and federal taxes all play a role in why costs are so high. There's also the landscape of our country being so vast and our population being smaller than in other foreign jurisdictions, for example.
I've only got very little time, so I'm going to ask perhaps if Mr. Rayot, if he understands the geography and could speak to the specific situation, because I don't think it's the taxes and fees in those different communities. They're very similar airports. And perhaps, Mr. Rayot, if you wouldn't mind commenting, because Air Canada is the primary carrier that we're concerned with, that would be appreciated.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for your question, Mr. Bachrach. It's difficult for me to comment on average price. You know, price always depend on market. They depend on demand and offer and demand. Also depends on the number of seats available on the aircraft and, you know, what time they are booked. So, I'll be pleased to follow up with your office and discuss if there is particular issue regarding your riding.
So in my previous role, I met with you several times, or met with your company rather, to talk about this specific issue. Now, Terrace is the only community that has WestJet, has a major competitor for Air Canada. Is the lack of competition what is allowing Air Canada to charge prices that are half again as much and twice as much out of Smithers and Prince Rupert, respectively?
Non, sorry, I'll answer in French. Non, je vous dirais que...
No, I would say that our market is competitive, and the prices in the various regions depend on a number of factors. The industry is coming out of a very difficult time, and so we have to bear these factors in mind.
5 or 10 years, it's been the same issue facing these communities. And I met with Air Canada several years ago and was told that because WestJet had entered the Terrace market, they had driven down prices, and that was going to be a very temporary situation because there was no way that WestJet was going to be able to sustain those prices. That was years ago, and still the price is twice as much to fly out of Prince Rupert and half again as much out of Smithers. Why, when you're flying the same airplanes, you're flying the same distance, are customers in some communities paying so much more? Like, it can't possibly be fair.
Je peux pas répondre.
I can't answer that because I wasn't there at those meetings. I didn't participate in the meeting. I can check with my colleagues, but as I said, each market is different, has different realities that have to be taken into account.
Okay, perhaps shifting back to Ms. Acton-Gervais, there's been some talk here about the vaccine mandates, and I know there are a lot of questions being asked by people, particularly about the domestic air travel mandate. And, I understand the government being a bit evasive when the questions are coming from the opposition, but your industry, your major stakeholders, you clearly have conversations, honest heart-to-heart conversations with the government about your industry, and you've said that this particular mandate is a concern for you. Have they explained to you why it is still in place? Have they talked to you about the mechanism that they see it affecting pandemic outcomes? I don't know if that's a clear question.
This has not been discussed directly with the National Airlines Council of Canada. We have not been presented with a direct mechanism. We do believe it is time for the federal mandates to be reviewed. To our knowledge, Canada is the only country currently with a domestic vaccine mandate.
Thank you for the answer. Mr. Gibbons, do you want to comment on the same thing?
Do I? No, I think I don't want to comment on what is motivating them or not. I think they all want a safe recovery. We're all partners in public health. The Prime Minister has singled out airlines for their work in curbing the spread of COVID, so I don't think there's any divide there. But I think it goes back to our observation. Is there anything that your constituents cannot do based on their vaccination status currently in your community? I don't think there's anything except boarding a WestJet aircraft at tariff for,
I'll just say,
for very low fares.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Next, we have Mr. Genereux. Mr. Genereux, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good to see you again, and thank you everybody for taking the time today. I have three questions that I'd love to kind of just get an answer to. So the first one, hoping just for a quick yes or no answer. Maybe I'll start with Mr. Gibbons. Is it the opinion of your organization that the removing of the legacy pandemic policy, so that's the on-site mandatory random testing, the duplicate questions at customs, and of course the removal of the vaccine mandate will improve operational challenges?
Yes.
I think that was a yes.
Yes.
Okay. So I'll go to Mr. Briot, same question. Do you believe that will improve operational challenges?
Oui, yes.
And Mr. Liebman, again, will that improve operational challenges?
I think you hear an industry position emerging.
Perfect. Well, I was going to go to our fourth witness, but I assume she'll have the same opinion. But I'll give her the floor just to do that as well, if she's so inclined.
Thank you for the question. Primary areas we would recommend revisiting federal policy include the Arrive CAN, user pay model, processing credentials for staffing, and legacy pandemic travel restrictions. All of these would help alleviate congestion at airports.
Great. Thank you. So I guess that's clear from our witnesses here. Every single airline and the industry present is calling for the removal of on-site mandatory random testing, duplicate questions at customs, and again, of course, the removal of the vaccine mandate. I want to turn to my second question to Mr. Gibbons. I'll begin with you, and if anybody would like to weigh in, please do. You mentioned in response to one of the questions that the science being used to make these mandates or these decisions would be helpful for every stakeholder have this information. Have you been presented this information from the government?
I think the data we've been presented by the government is sort of the aggregate public data about the general COVID situation that we're in and the state of the pandemic and the number of cases and hospitalizations. And of course, the Public Health Agency, Mr. Genereux, throughout the pandemic has had the percentage of inbound travelers who've tested positive for COVID. So there has been some public data that everyone has shared. I think our requests are more around the precise policies that we see and what are the precise benefits to the overall COVID equation of, and I'll use the example of the Omicron mandates, which were put in place. We wanted to understand better what exactly these measures were going to prevent or not with specificity for the airline sector. So it's more about understanding what are the recommendations precisely that were made by public health officials, and how was the government informed in terms of these decisions, just so we can take away questions like this at committee and take away discussions about who's with science and who's not. We just got to move past that and talk very strictly and purely about.
So there's no, I guess, there's no additional science then that you've been privy to that isn't public right now, I guess, is the meat of my question.
Look, we have a great relationship with the government. There's lots of discussions about science and metrics. I would say primarily it has been what is in the public domain for everyone to see and understand. And in that respect, there has been, general aggregate information available.
And I want to ask you I'll probably stick with you, Mr. Gibbons. I'm going to ask one quick question to you that I think is a little bit outside of the mandate questions that we've been focusing on. But can you talk about, is it correct that airlines are the only entity that have obligations to take care of travelers and ensure they're informed and cared for?
A good question. I believe some of this came up at committee the other day. I think someone asked the minister about the standards of care, and I think that's one of the issues that's coming to light here with these delays. And just to give you an example, Mr. Genereux, there's some evenings in Toronto where 700 of our guests have to be reaccommodated onto other flights, and oftentimes we will have almost half a dozen flights where families are prevented from leaving the airplane just to enter the customs hall. So, in our industry, we have a very strict regulatory environment, as we should as a federally regulated company. And when it comes to something like a tarmac delay, we have obligations that at a half hour you have to do this, at 60 minutes you have to do that. You have to make sure water is there. You have to make sure the communications to our guests are clear and that we're communicating why the delay is happening and what they're entitled to and not entitled to. So I think, part of this, and in terms of improving the overall system and traveler experience, we are observing that for every touch point for the traveler in Canadian society, airlines seemingly are the only ones with service standard obligations and regulatory requirements that need to be met. So, I think it's an open.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gibbons,
thank you.
And thank you very much, Mr. Genereux. Next, we have Mr. Iacono. Mr. Iacono, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Je remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being present today. Ms. Acton-Gervais, I have understood that CATSA has difficulties rehiring these screening officers because some of them were hired as baggage handlers or had another type of job, and I'm presuming that these employees are vaccinated. Is that correct? There's a mandate for the employees, so I believe so. But were they hired in other types of jobs? I can't confirm that. Could you come back to us with that? Yes, we could do that. Tell us, what contributes to the delays that we are witnessing in the airports? The delays? Right now, we have arrivals, and with all of the health measures that are in place in the airports, that the passengers are delayed. It's very difficult for employees who are dealing with these passengers who are very frustrated, and due to a lack of staff at the CBSA, well, prior to the pandemic, it took 30 seconds to process a passenger, and now it takes 5 times that amount. So 2.5 minutes. As the interim president of the airport authorities in Canada, about 50,000 passengers arrive in Toronto per day, and this is going to increase this summer. What is the percentage of employees who are vaccinated? Do you know what the percentage of employees who aren't vaccinated? I don't have the data to answer your question. Pardon me, I heard that it was due to the fact that the employees aren't vaccinated. That's what's preventing you from providing a service. So my question is as follows. What is the number of employees who are not vaccinated, and which in turn has an impact on the work? As you say, how does I'm not sure I understood the question. Are you talking about border service employees or talking about airline passengers? Both. So I think that for the border services, that's a question that you should direct to the agency. On the other hand, when it comes to the members here today, well, we know about 10% of Air Canada's workforce is not vaccinated. So how can we follow up on the international delays internationally? Is there any type of organization that compiles information on delays in airports? There is an organization, the International Airport Transport Association, which I mentioned previously. This is an association that represents international airlines. There are over 200 members globally, and the headquarters is in Montreal, and this organization is compiling data. Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Rowe, Liebman, and Gibbons. Could each of you tell us very briefly what federal programs were the most useful that you used to get through this pandemic? I'll start with you, Mr. Gibbons.
With respect to federal support during the pandemic, our company did not negotiate a support package with the federal government. I believe we're the only airline who did not do so. So we did not participate in that support that was under discussion. We did use the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, and we have thanked the government on multiple occasions for the importance of that and keeping our employees, because we have a very strong culture, keeping them tied to our business. But the wage subsidy at the same time was also a flow through to avoid people going on EI. But we did take advantage of that program, and we're grateful for it.
Thank you. Mr. Liebman?
Yes, thank you for the question. I'd like to say that on behalf of the 4,000 colleagues of mine at Air Transat, we're very grateful for the generous financial support of the government to get through this unprecedented pandemic. As I mentioned earlier, Air Transat was shut down twice and significantly impacted by Omicron. Prior to COVID, Air Transat had never received a cent in federal financial support, and so we made great use of the wage subsidy for our employees, and we are as well borrowers under the LEAF, the Large Employer Emergency Financial Financing Program. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liebman, and merci beaucoup, Mr. Iacono. Prochainement.
Thank you, Mr. Iacono. Mr. Barcelo-Duval, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Earlier, when the various airlines were questioned, we heard a lot about the airport charges imposed by the government, which really weighed heavily on them during this recovery. You, who represent the airlines, if you compare Canada to other countries in the world and look at the way that they manage their airports and their airfares and the associated charges, do you know what jurisdictions in the world where things are done differently? And if so, which jurisdiction should we be basing ourselves on? That's a very good question. There are some jurisdictions who use the same model, but they have evolved. And during the pandemic, we saw what our vulnerabilities were, and we saw what the shortcomings were in our funding model. And that's why we're asking the government to look at taking immediately look at these charges and reinvest the money into the transportation sector. Thank you. Mr. Liebman, I asked everybody this question, but during the pandemic, the NAV Canada charges were really going up. I don't know what that impact had on big airlines, but I know that that had a terrible impact on smaller airlines. Do you think that was the right way of doing business? Do you think that in the future we should take a second look at the way we impose charges? Thank you for your question. Yes, indeed. We were shut down for a long time, so the impact will be felt in the future. But for us, the question is to look at the model in English, the user pay model. And if there are no users, there's no payers. So that poses a problem. The system won't work then. So perhaps we could take this opportunity to look at this system, how our system is funded, and look at best practices elsewhere. The Industry Strategy Council prepared a report that covered this issue, and I think that this would be very useful to take a look at this report soon. Thank you very much, Mr. Lieben and Mr. Barcelo-Duval. Next.
Mr. Backrack, the floor is yours. You have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I listened recently to an interview with Barry Rempel, who is recently retired from the Winnipeg Airport Authority. And he really highlighted that the congestion we're seeing at the airports is in part due to the airlines shifting to a hub and spoke model with fewer direct flights from medium airports, and that's putting more passengers into hubs like Toronto Pearson. Is this accurate, and do you acknowledge the role that airline scheduling has played in contributing to the situation we're seeing at Pearson?
Airline
If I can answer.
I'd like to touch on that.
Go ahead, Suzanne.
I've only got 2.5 minutes.
Perhaps, if I may, I would say that the concentration of international long-haul flight to key hubs has always been there. Was like that before the pandemic, And in fact, even in hubs like Toronto Pearson, we have less departure than pre-pandemic. So no, this is not the factor that is creating all the delay that we have now.
I mean, I could not disagree with our friend Mr. Rimple anymore with respect to that comment, and I don't think the Minister of Transport could disagree anymore either, because what he said last week was he will not ask airlines to change their schedules. He has not asked and will never ask airlines to change their schedule, because I think we all need to think about it like it's potash going through the Port Authority or it's an auto part getting through the border. Our product needs to move through the facilities. We're the investors and the job creators. So I absolutely do not accept that airline schedules, which are created to maximize job creation and economic connectivity, are at fault here.
I think I have time for one more quick one. Could the federal government have better anticipated the rebound in air traffic and air travel? Ms. Acton-Gervais, you want to?
Throughout the pandemic, we have worked very closely with the Government of Canada, and we have been working towards the restart of aviation. Could it have been better prepared for? Perhaps that is if that is a question posed to them. In our view, we are certainly looking for these agencies to be resourced in order to support the rebound of air travel. This is not just about our businesses, it is about the traveler experience, and it is also about Canada's reputation on the world stage.
Thank you very much, Madame Acton-Gervais, and thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. Prochainement, nous avons Mr. Joël Godin.
Mr. Joël Godin, you have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chair, I'll jump in for Mr. Godin if we're looking for a conservative.
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I want to get back to a bit of a question that started with Mr. Gibbons. My colleague had asked the minister last week if he's going to bring in those performance standards and passenger rights into government services for travel. I'm just curious as to your thoughts on that, and would your guests, would your travelers appreciate something like that?
I think so, because it's the same logic that led to the APPR regulations, which this committee studied and which the previous Minister of Transport brought forward. So if you believe that regulations are good to keep an airline, honest or on track, and that passengers should very clearly know what they're entitled to or not entitled to, I think that should apply to everyone who's delivering a service to a Canadian traveler or a foreign visitor. So the answer to that question is yes, we would support it. And no matter where you are in the traveler journey, I think you should have a really good understanding of what you're entitled to, and that could even include compensation. But I think that's a good issue for this committee to look at. And I just add one more note to that, Mr. Genru, which is, these aren't just consumer nuisances and the word delays. If facilitation processes aren't world class in Southern Ontario, citizens there will cross the border and head to Detroit or Buffalo. So it's a competitiveness issue as well for Canada. We have to stop bleeding guests and gifting air traffic and jobs to that sector in that country, and we need to keep them here. So it's not just convenience and delay. It's a fundamental economic issue for the country we have to get right.
And thank you, Mr. Gibbons. I want to pick up on that, but go to Mr. Liebman, if I will, on some of that economic competitiveness. When a consumer has the option to, in Mr. Gibbons' example, choose one region over the other. So take the border cities that we all know well, where they can jump across the border and fly on a different airline that perhaps has less of those concerning challenges that passengers often face. Curious if you can comment on perhaps providing our committee with some examples of where that happens and how it's leaving the Canadian airline less competitive in some regions of the world.
Sure. Thank you for the question. And I mean, it's no surprise to anybody on this committee that many of the large city airports are in close proximity to the US border. And so there are border airports there. It goes back to the user pay model that I spoke to earlier, which forces significant fees, through to the users. And in another jurisdiction, such as the United States, for example, where airports and air travel are not viewed as a tax, generator to general revenues, as far as I understand it, those fees and charges are much less. So if a family of 5 or 6 or 4, multiply by a few $100s in fees per person, is looking to avoid that, they could go elsewhere, and it becomes a competitiveness issue, and then it will have an impact on, I would say, a rather critical industry for bringing goods and people across a country as large as ours. So it's certainly a question worthy of further study.
And I guess just quickly, Mr. Rio, if comment on some of the economic competitiveness that Air Canada is facing with other airlines around the world.
Like I said, all tax and fees imposed in the industry is something that we must look at very carefully as a country because it impacts the competitiveness of the carriers. And if we want to build a global connectivity in Canada and powerful hubs, we have to make sure that the infrastructure and the cost and the fees are competitive at a global scale.
So what would some of those taxes and fees be then that you would advocate for?
I'll give you an example. Canada is the only country that charge airport rent to its main airports. This will, discuss, I think for Montreal, for instance, it's something like 50 million a year that is going back to the federal government without any service and being in return, or without that money being reinvested in the industry. So all the tax and fees that are collected from the industry should at least be reinvested in the industry to improve the infrastructure.
Thanks. I believe my time's up, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. General. You are one of the few that leaves 20 seconds on the table. So I appreciate that very much. Helps me keep on time. Next, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our guest and to the people virtually. Thank you for being here today and participating in our important study. I've been a part of this committee since 2019, and there are many debates around this table with people about vaccines and vaccine mandates and how we protect people during the height of COVID and the importance of protecting the health of Canadians. And so many of the measures we've taken, obviously, has been about the health and safety of Canadians, including vaccine mandates and so on. And I know, as Mr. Badaway said, we all want to do the right thing here for the country and for the airline industry and every other industry. So I want to ask you this, Mr. Gibbons, and then maybe Mr. Rio could react as well. The Minister of Transport has announced a number of working groups to help address the issues of delays in the industry. So have the airlines been included in these groups? And do you think or feel that the federal government is taking the delays issue seriously?
I absolutely think that the government's taking it seriously because it is serious. And I think they're seized with it, and I think the minister's comments have made it clear that he's seized with it. But we have to talk about how we measure progress, right? We're not just talking about whether the customs haul should take you 4 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. There are Canadians that can't get off our aircraft, sometimes for 2 hours. This is a crisis situation in our view. But to your question, we are involved. He has engaged us, and we are working collaboratively with them on solutions. The answer to that is yes.
Mr. Rio?
Yeah, I would agree with my colleague. We are involved. There are discussions with the government, and everybody understands that this is a very serious situation that require immediate action to be taken. I would say, from also an industry perspective, what's different now versus 3 years ago is all the health requirement and check that needs to be made by agent, for instance, when people arrive in Canada. And this has an impact on average processing time. And when you multiply it by the thousands of passengers arriving a day, this is certainly a cause of the bottleneck we are seeing now at the airport. And this is why we think the process should be streamlined. And I also just want to add on the comment made previously by my colleague Suzanne, just on the vaccination rate. I just want to, to say that our employees at Air Canada, we have a very high compliance rate for vaccination. That is, I think, au-delà de 98%. Merci.
More than 98%.
Yeah. So, I remember a testimony back previously when we talked about COVID when it first originated. Some people predicted that there'd be 5 years before the airline industry rebounded. What's your thoughts on that? And what kind of measures have been introduced so far or are being contemplated that might assist with the problem we're dealing with here with the airlines? Or Ms. Acton-Gervais?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of the question.
So what kind of measures have been introduced so far or are being contemplated that would be of assistance to the airlines and the airline industry from the federal government side?
I think we have been focused on recovery and we've been focused on removing barriers to that recovery so we can maximize job creation and connectivity. So we're on track with that. Speaking as WestJet, in June this month, we will be at 100% of pre-pandemic. We will fly as many seats as we did in June 2019 pre-pandemic. So we're very proud of that. So we're doing our part to bring this country back. And
the 5-year projection that some people had.
Some said 5, some said 7, some
Yeah.
said 3. I think it's a testament to our employees and the work they've done.
What do you see what do you see as the improvements we've seen for the past few weeks? Is there a particular trend? Are things getting better or getting worse? What's your thoughts?
I've seen some statistics from the government that suggest things are getting better. I don't want to be, it's not a, we have to determine how we measure success and what's the goal. I think the sort of extreme tarmac delays we have seen are less frequent than they have been, but we need that trend to continue. So
in the right direction.
We're seeing some progress. We're seeing some progress. I think we can conclude that. But the gravity of this situation and crisis is really something.
Mr. Ryu, would you agree with that assessment?
There has been some progress, I agree, but definitely we need to continue to improve, add resources, review and streamline the processes because we are going soon into the summer peak season and traveler volume will increase. So I think all agencies involved in the transportation sector needs also to get prepared for this. They all have planned, and there was an announcement last week. So definitely there is still some work to do to improve the traveler experience.
Yeah, and I could say that the flights in and out of Gander have vastly improved in the last few weeks. And thank you very much for that. Mr.
We're very pleased to serve your community, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rogers. That concludes the first round of testimony for today. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses for joining us and providing their testimony. I'd now ask that they log off and ask that my colleagues stay on. We will be suspending for approximately 3 minutes. This meeting stands suspended.
Thank you.
This meeting has now resumed. Colleagues and members of the committee appearing before us for the second half of today's meeting, we have from the Coopérative de Transport Régional du Québec, Mr. Serge Larivière, Directeur Général, President of Mont-Tremblant International Airport, and as well from the town of Smithers, we have Mayor Gladys Attrell. We will begin with opening remarks. I will turn the floor over to Mayor Attrell. The floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation to speak to you today about this. And particularly, I'm going to focus on our airport, the Smithers Regional Airport, or YYD. It's owned by the town of Smithers, and that's a community of about 5,400 people with a service area of about 20,000, including many other small communities and Indigenous communities. Before the pandemic, YYD was run like a business, and essentially it paid for itself. We had 68,000 passengers in 2019. Last year, 2021, at 37,000 at about 50 to 60% of revenues. Pre-pandemic, scheduled passenger service was provided by 2 airlines, Air Canada and Central Mountain Air, 4 flights per day. Today, 1 flight provided by Air Canada, Q400, with 78 passenger capacity. The airport provides a base for charters to remote camps and tourism, lodges, fishing, hunting, etc. Our hospital also receives patients from across Northwest BC with medevacs, air medevacs, at about 260 per year. The airport plays a role during emergencies. During recent extraordinary wildfires, the airport was a base to wildfire crews, aircraft, and military personnel. And of course, residents choose where they want to live based on amenities. In the last few years, we've made many improvements to the airport, terminal modernization, runway. Coming up next will be lights, runway lights, etc. And we are very much a grant-dependent airport, and we're grateful for those grants. Also, COVID money and money from the Regional Airport Air Transportation Initiative. Research shows that the Smithers Regional Airport is one of the lowest cost airports for an airline to land a Q400. That is the aircraft currently being used by Air Canada. So it's not the fees that we charge that deter flights. That said, we do have a passenger fee to help with revenues. So the question, does government red tape make airports more expensive? Well, probably, but some regulations can be difficult. Some safety regulations, I suggest, are well accepted. I want to suggest, though, there may be a different view on regulations that could help airports and communities like ours reliant on one airline. During the pandemic, the Canadian government offered support to airlines, and I support that, and I think it's time to offer that to small and medium-sized airports. Consider regulation that might link miles flown to price charged. For example, in our area, Terrace to Vancouver and Smithers to Vancouver are about the same mileage, the same aircraft is often used, and yet it is often way more expensive to fly from Smithers. People comment on you could buy a ticket to other parts of Canada, other parts of the world sometimes, and that unfair pricing hurts small communities, not just Smithers. And don't get me wrong, I am happy to have Air Canada serve our community. I flew with them yesterday, and I'll fly home from Regina on Air Canada. But if there isn't competition, there needs to be a reasonable way to regulate so that one community isn't paying a higher price than its neighbor for the same service, same aircraft, same distance. Residents choose to drive, sometimes on very dangerous winter roads, to save money. Businesses and industries choose to locate at other bases to operate from. Lack of consultation on scheduling hurts too. Last year, ski operators had to scramble after a late season schedule change affected their clients, driving them to other airports. I'm hearing the same from guide outfitters in our community that are finding their clients are being driven because the current 1 flight per day early morning schedule doesn't suit them. Air Canada has too big an influence on the health and future of our community. Its use of third-party contractors at the airport further reduces the quality of experience for passengers. When a flight's delayed, bags are lost, the people behind the counter don't work for the airline. They work for a contractor who can't offer them the help. They're told instead to phone the airline, and we all know that phoning an airline, especially when a whole plane load of people is trying to phone, doesn't help. Customers don't understand the nuance of who works for who, and our airport gets the blame. Air Canada is going to get those passengers anyway, especially if people have to drive down the road simply to fly from Terrace or Prince George. It doesn't provide reason for them to work with us. So I suggest reasonable regulation could create a path toward an equitable system for small airports like YYD, which is so critical to our community, as the airport is such a significant cultural and economic driver. I do have one other area, and I might not get through it for time, and it's regarding sort of transport or landing systems. But I want to focus on this piece about the regulation for airlines when we have one airline with no competition. We really can't afford to have more and more people leaving small towns because of lack of opportunity. Our cities can't support more people, and citizens want to live in different parts of our province and country. In this day and age, though, we can't thrive without adequate air access. I understand the need to review regulation and to remove those that no longer serve a purpose. I urge you, though, to consider the upside of regulation that creates fairness. We at the town of Smithers do not have a lot of clout with Air Canada, and yet our economic health is tied to the decision-making of that airline. We are ready to be part of a successful network of regional airports serving our residents, our neighbors, and to jump into provincial emergencies when we need to. But reliable, fairly priced, quality air service is essential to our community. And I'll stop there to make way for questions.
Thank you very much, Mayor Attrell. Prochainement, nous avons Monsieur Larivière et Monsieur Larivière.
Now we have Mr. Larivière. You have 5 minutes for your opening statement. The floor is yours. Thank you to the committee for welcoming me here today. I'll be making my statement in French. Although the subject of airport fees is a broad and complex issue, and I could go on to great extent about the negative impact of the federal government withdrawing support for the aviation sector in Canada, but you listened to my colleague from Air Transit earlier. But my intervention today will focus on the charges levied by two federally regulated agencies, namely the Canada Border Service Agencies and CATSA. Although I'm involved in, as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, I'm involved in regional airline transportation as president of the TREQ. I will be speaking to you today as the president of the Mont-Tremblant International Airport. This airport has been active for 20 years and is a tourist airport with 80% of its aviation revenues coming from international flights. Domestically, the airport receives commercial flights from Porter Airlines and Air Canada. So it's on behalf of my airport, but also on behalf of several other regional airports in Canada, that I would like to talk to you about a significant issue of coherence. Indeed, for the past few years, starting with the CBSA, a new practice was implemented. And here I refer to a cost recovery service. Back in the 90s and beforehand, when the federal government declared an airport as being an airport of entry, what we call an AOE, the cost of custom clearing service was assumed by Ottawa. I believe that our port was one of the first to be subject to this new practice. In 2006, faced with the real demand of international air traffic, the federal government, designated our airport as an AOE. The agency informed us, however, that despite this designation, it could not serve us unless we accepted to pay for their services. We did understand that the operating budget from the federal government had not been increased to take these new services in mind. So we were faced with this impossible decision of accepting to be treated differently from other airports or not get the customs clearing service. Since the viability of our airport is directly tied to our international flights, a refusal would have meant shutting down the airport. Since the initial clearing charges were only $275 per plane, we accepted, but we did accept the practice. But 15 years down the line, custom clearing services for a 4 or 15-seat aircraft landing at the Mont-Tremblant Airport went from $275 to $1,200. So there's a basic question. Why are certain regions in Canada paying for clearing services through taxes paid to the federal government, and others, such as ours, and such as those located in the Charlevoix and elsewhere, have to pay for customs clearing service on top of the federal taxes. So a fundamental principle of our democracy is being violated. In English, we say no taxation without representation. We have to realize that CBSA, under the principle of cost recovery, gave itself taxation authorities. And since this is an agency, it doesn't have to be accountable to the public. This deviation creates two classes of citizens in Canada, those of the regions and the others. As if this weren't enough, in the face of a lack of direction and leadership on the part of the government, another agency, CATSA, recently decided to offer its cost recovery services. The federal government must reassume the leadership of the situation. It's the government's decision to decide when it wishes to designate an airport as an AOE, but if this designation is made, the budgets in its agencies must be adjusted and suspend the capacity of this agency to impose cost recovery charges. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Larivière.
Thank you, Mr. Larivière, and thank you, Ms. Atrell. We'll begin the questions now with Mr. Dowdle. You have 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but I'm going to cede my time to Mr. Joel Godin.
Monsieur Godin, la parole est à vous.
Mr. Godin, the floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay? I didn't do a sound test, so can you hear me okay? I'll check with the clerk. Mr. Clerk, yes, it sounds good. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for being present today. My question is for Mr. Larivière, since I'm a Quebec MP and his airport is located in the province of Quebec. Mr. Larivière, what you outlined is that there is one treatment for small airports and another for large airports. How can you explain the fact that there are two different worlds, two different treatments, and two different bills? I understand from what you've said is that you're forced to put give the bill to the clients. Mathematically speaking, in an airport like yours, you need to be able to be sustainable. Is that your reality? There's a little nuance here that needs to be made. It's not the small versus the large. It's the new versus the old. So all of the airports who have been designated or which have been designated as OAEs, well, unfortunately, we're the ones who started this whole thing off. So all the airports that were added after that have to do this. So you have to pay even if the federal government gave you this designation. And Mr. Godin, to add to that, this has had an impact that's quite significant. Why? Because Quebec was behind in the number of airports with custom clearing services. At the start, when I began, we had a third of the airports compared to Ontario. Ontario had commercial flights, I think, at 39 different airports who had OAE status. In Quebec, I was the third airport because Little Mont-Tremblant is located between Quebec City and Montreal. So we were 15 years behind. And then Charlevoix and other regions came along. They need these custom clearing services. But those who made the request after 2006, well, there's no grandfather clause, and these airports were stuck with cost recovery. So there's no association that represents you to the federal government to change this practice? Because this is unfair competition. It's as if we would put our foot on the pedal, but is it because of competition? No, I think to relate an informal conversation I had with the Director General of the CBSA, he confessed to me that the federal government had not changed his budget. The government didn't give the agency the money it needed to provide these services in the airport, even if the government designated us as an OAE. So, given this situation, we're the if we don't accept a pay, we can't function. So, I'm not encouraging you to be disobedient, but I would encourage all the small airports in this type of situation, if you were to decide to operate, what impact would this have on air traffic? Mr. Godin, this is public information. We did disobey. We were successful in getting direct flights from New York City using Intercontinental Airlines. The custom services, well, the airline company said it wasn't going to pay so that was $1,200 per aircraft. Yes, $1,200 per aircraft. And let's say there are 30 people. Welcome to Canada, $1,200. Thank you very much. And given our refusal to pay this bill, the CBSA contacted with the CRA and we announced that we would shut down the airport, and then we had an ad hoc agreement, but we did lose our international airline because of this situation. When did this happen? In 2000? I think it was 2008 or 2009. I know that in Quebec this week there was an announcement made for $100 tickets. Did that affect you? No, because these are domestic flights within Quebec, and most of our flights come from outside Quebec. We have flights from Toronto. We also have private clients who come from Europe or the United States. So that didn't really have an impact on us. How much time do I have remaining? 10 seconds, Mr. Godin. I will have other questions for you, Mr. Larivière, but I'll give some time to the other MPs so they can ask your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Godin. Now we have Ms. Koutrakis. You have 6 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my questions will be for Mr. Larivière. Thank you very much for your testimony. And Ms. Adriel as well. I'd like to have a better understanding of your model. Is your co-op really operational now? Or is it still a proposal? It's still at a proposal stage. The conditions, the market conditions have to be set up to enable us to go ahead with this, but this has not been done yet. We are continuing to discuss the matter with the provincial government, but also with the federal government to implement this service. Mr. Larivière, your co-op, is it based on other co-ops in other regions or based on other types of co-ops in Quebec that are in sectors other than the transportation sector? I must confess I don't know any other airline companies that are getting involved in a co-op project. This is happening in Quebec, where the stakeholders have decided collectively that try and rectify the situation because the price of of an airplane ticket is deficient in Quebec. It's far behind Ontario and the rest of Canada. And in Quebec, we have this mindset to form co-ops. Think about Desjardins. We have a problem. We put our heads together and form a co-op to rectify the situation. This is a natural reflex. We're a little bit original. We did this in agriculture. We did this in the financial sector. So we're thinking about doing in the aviation sector. It's a model. It's a motor. What would you need to get long-term viability? Do you need a certain number of members or a volume of passengers? Or I think that the main ingredient is a market that's good. There are some players in Canada that compete. I'll be nice here. Let's say they compete, but in a very aggressive way. And we have to react to maintain our competitiveness, keep it healthy. We did this with the big monopolies in the oil sector, where the big ate up the small companies. So this market correction is required in Canada to enable new carriers to get set up and to get through the first few years, which are always very difficult. Mr. Larivière, one final question. Do you think that a co-op such as yours could be done throughout the country in Canada? Because perhaps Quebec could show the rest of Canada what you could do. I was listening to one of the MPs in British Columbia.
Discrepancy in pricing of airfare between two destinations with the same aircraft with the same distance. Well, guess what? This is what we've got across Quebec, right? It's a question of competition, right? The minute you introduce competition, suddenly, the prices are going down. So how do we enable more competition? How do we make sure that competition could get in place and thrive and exist and perform? It's you guys are there for that, right? When you
so I'm not going to let you up
behave correctly.
Thank you.
You got to go in and make it work in the right way.
So then I will
or something.
So then I will put this
operate right.
So then I will put this to you this way. What would you do if you were government? What kind of recommendations can you give this government to ensure that the small regional airports are competitive?
It's first thing, put floor price. You put floor price across destination, saying you cannot go below that price, Mr. Airline X, because we know that below that price, you're doing it to kill the other guy, right? And it's the same, they did it in the gas industry. Floor price exists in milk. Floor price exists in gasoline, So could we apply floor price to airfare? Absolutely. And the minute you establish the fact that nobody could kill you except on just providing good service and quality, efficient air service, you'll see a bunch of investors showing up to the table. Investors that are not coming to the table for regional service. Why? Nobody's got a $20 million to lose in a price war with a guy that, could put 20 million in his balance sheet without, and nobody will notice.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Larivière. Merci.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Larivière. Thank you, Ms. Koutrakis. Next, we have Mr. Barcelo Duval. You have 6 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too would like to ask Mr. Larivière a question. I have the impression that when we talk when we hear about the government's vision of airports, it doesn't necessarily include the importance of regional transportation. There are foreign flights. We talk about them a lot, which I think they should be viewed as critical transportation. I don't know if you share my vision on this. Do you think, for instance, that we should have a different approaches based on the status of the airport or on the size of the airport or the region? And as you were saying, in smaller regions, there are charges that have to be paid for essential services that are, which should be assumed by the federal government rather than imposed on these small airports. The answer is yes. The answer is yes. If I could draw a parallel, it's like data. It's like getting internet in your region. Is that a luxury to have internet? No. It's an essential tool. It's an essential tool that allows you to connect to the rest of your country or your province. Regional air transport. Well, Canada is a huge country with very low population density. And I'll speak for Quebec. If we're at the bottom of the line when it comes to aviation transportation, there's a cost to pay. It prevents us from developing our territories, and it hurts some industries that are completely annihilated. Tourism right now. Well, forget about that. We'll never attract tourists to the North Shore or the Gaspé with prices that are high like that. So there are various approaches that can be taken. Can we help small airports to lower their costs? Maybe NAVCAN Canada could lower their costs. Don't forget that people in the regions are very sensitive to the price of a ticket. If I want to go spend my vacation in Paris and I have excess costs of $37 at the airport, okay. But if I try to go to the Gaspé to go for a weekend and I have to pay $300 or $50 or $400 and then airport fees of $150, well, it's just too much, and people just don't do it. Do you know any jurisdictions elsewhere in the world that have practical measures to encourage the viability of small airports? Well, you don't have to go very far. Just look at United States. Canada has taken a different approach than the U.S., and that goes back decades. Americans invest in the infrastructure of the airports, whether it be private or public. 80%. The FAA pays 80% of infrastructure costs. Here in Canada, we tell airports to look after yourselves. The Trudeau Airport has to build its own airport. Same with Lesage Airport, and pass the costs on to passengers. I must confess, there are certain programs that help us, but it doesn't cover the capital costs or the loss in operations because now we have fewer passengers. So obviously there's something that could be done in Canada. We could look at what's happening just south of the border. A few years ago, I had an opportunity to meet an airline carrier who said that for regional transportation, the taxes of the government represented 40% of the air ticket. Do you think if the air tickets cost less than 40%, would that have an impact? Yes. Yes, that's easy to answer that. You know, transportation is a product, and it's sensitive to the price. And yes, we at the Mont Tremblant Airport with the Ontario carriers, Porter, we test this sensitivity to price. Returned Toronto Airport, that was $350, that's unusual in Quebec. There's no other region that can have a return ticket for that price. And we filled the planes, but they're under $40. There is a market. People will get on regional plans. We tested this. If we have return tickets that are higher than that price, people decide to take their car. Or they decide, I'm not going to go, or I'll take the plane to Cancun with Air Canada because it costs less to go there than to take a plane to the Gaspé. Thank you very much, Mr. Barcelo-Duval. Thank you, Mr. Larivière. And finally, we have Mr. Backrack.
As the final spot today, the floor is yours. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses. That was a very interesting presentation by Mr. Larivière, and I'm going to focus my questions towards Mayor Attrell. And I think there are some real similarities here because we're talking about the affordability of air travel in smaller communities and more rural regions and the impact on economies. So Mayor Attrell, I'd like to start off with the question about the economic impact of airline pricing and scheduling on the community of Smithers and the surrounding area.
Thanks, Mr. Backrack. I think we feel the weight of that for the benefit of the other folks here. So Smithers to our nearest community is 2.5 hours down the road to the nearest airport. And we do feel a bleed that people feel the attraction, as the previous witness said, of a cheaper flight. So it's one thing to have passengers making the decision, but also because there has been a decision to increase the frequency from our neighboring airport as well, there seems like a greater attraction in price and a greater attraction in opportunity. So it's not just residents making a decision to choose a different or a cheaper flight. It's businesses also making a decision that their businesses might be better served, even though primarily our community, Smithers and the Bulkley Valley, might have been the community of choice, but economy matters. So if there's increased frequency and the sometimes perception, but often really a lower price from a neighboring community. And again, this is the same mileage that I mentioned before. So it's often the same aircraft, the same flown miles, but the price is cheaper. So those are things that it's very difficult for us to compete against. So once a business chooses to relocate to another community, it's very difficult to get them back. And it's one thing, it may be a small business, but sometimes these are large industrial operators that are going to take with them residents. And now there's a whole cycle that happens after that. When businesses and residents choose to relocate, it takes with you some of the things that drive your community. I was listening the other day to decisions being made regarding healthcare and how healthcare services may be located. These things link together. And so it's hard to just tether out only the impact of the cost of air travel because it spills out to the entire success of the community, whether or not businesses will be there, whether extenuating programs will be located there. And particularly the previous witness as well commented on tourism. We're a tourism center. And so our tourism businesses have to be able to greet their clients, and clients have to be able to connect to other communities. So they're not going to overnight in Vancouver and then overnight in Smithers because we have one flight per day. So the economic cost and the cultural cost to the community with the relocation of businesses, I think, is severe.
So much, Mayor Attrell. Now, the Smithers Airport is a municipal airport. Many of the costs of operating an airport are fixed costs. If revenues from airlines decrease due to scheduling decisions or due to competition from neighboring airports, what kind of choices is the municipality forced to make?
Well, there's not many choices to make. We have limited places to get money. So as I had mentioned previously, pre-pandemic, the airport ran almost as an independent business, even though it is owned and operated by the municipality. But COVID showed the weakness of that. As the revenues dropped, the places where we can get money are through relief, and there was some of that. That was helpful, but the source we have to get money is taxation. So Smithers is a community of 5,400 people. It's a very small community. The airport serves a larger geographic area, but we do not have ability to tax or collect money from others. We are attempting to do that, but that is not actually what exists now. So if there are costs or shortfalls at that airport, the last ditch place to get the money is actually from the residents who live there through taxation. We haven't gone there, but it got awfully close in the last couple of years.
Thank you, Mayor Attrell. Now, we heard from Mr. LaRiviere just a moment ago that in the United States, the federal government plays a much bigger role in funding airport infrastructure. I understand, and you mentioned in your opening remarks, that the Smithers Airport has an airport improvement fee that is charged to passengers. I'm wondering how this affects affordability and whether there might be better approaches to ensuring that airport infrastructure is maintained.
Well, I think it does affect affordability. People, it's less obvious than it used to be because it's hidden in the fee, but of course people do know it's there. So we have a fairly high passenger fee. It's $30 per person. So it's high and people know it's there. The one thing I think though about, requirements for a certain level of service, the federal government regulates the airports, tells us how to operate them. That's okay. Except as a small airport, sometimes then we're told we have to upgrade something or a system is now not adequate and it must be upgraded by a certain period of time. That's fine. But because we are so reliant on the grant system, it seems to me, not just with airports, but with many systems where we fall under regulation of other orders of government, if you know we must make an improvement in order to function, what I suggest is that the money should be there at the same time. So if we receive a new regulation that says lighting must be to a certain standard or water must be to a certain standard, and it's known that the only place to get the money to do that is through a federal grant, why don't they come together? Otherwise, it puts all this tension on a local service provider, the municipality, who's then trying to figure out, well, how are we possibly going to get the money? We don't write the regulations, but we have to respond to them in the time frame given. And the only place we have to go is to other orders of government to get the financing. So I guess I think one of the things that makes sense is rather than creating the heartache and agony, attach the funding to the program. Then when you tell us to do something, we know how and by when.
Thank you. I know smaller airports rely really heavily on the ACAP program to support their infrastructure. Are there ways that the federal government could strengthen the ACAP program to better meet the needs of airports such as Smithers?
The ACAP program has been amazing for us. We rely on it, and because it often offers a very high percentage of the money required, that sort of, it speaks to almost what I was saying before. I think it's back to letting us know in a timely way that the money required to meet the regulatory requirement, be it equipment, keeping the runway clear, keeping the lights on, know that that's going to happen in a timely way so that we're not going to get close to being, out of the reporting regime, so that we're not close to failure, not meeting something. I just think tethering the instruction to do something by when the regulation ought to be more closely linked to the opportunity to get the funding to do it. I concur with the previous witness. These small airports are critical to the people who live in rural and remote parts of Canada. And it's not just for the citizens there, it's for our entire province. We are a resource center. We provide much to the rest of the province and to the country, and we need that kind of support to keep our community healthy and thriving.
So much, Mayor Attrell. Thanks for being here today. Thank you to both of our witnesses. I'm going to hand the balance of my time back to the chair and wish everyone a good day.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bachrach. I will echo what you said and thank Mayor Attrell as well as Monsieur Larivière for your testimony today. We very much appreciate it. This meeting is now adjourned.
Thank you.